The United States was in a state of tension in the years leading up to the Civil War. A culprit of tension was the territory of Kansas. The nation knew when Kansas became a state, it would alter the balance of power between North and South. Kansas Territory became known as Bleeding Kansas because of the violent clashes between anti-slavery and pro-slavery groups. Some settlers in Missouri crossed the Kansas border and attacked residents who spoke out against slavery. At the same time, though, Kansas settlers conducted vicious raids in Missouri. Although Bleeding Kansas refers to the violence that was spread across the Kansas and Missouri border, in the end it was a ratified piece of paper that decided the future for the state of Kansas. The events of Bleeding Kansas took place roughly between 1854 and 1861. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. It also abolished the Missouri Compromise, which said that slavery could not extend above the 3630 line, and welcomed the concept of popular sovereignty. Nebraska's geographical location was so far north, its future as a free state was never a question. Kansas had a more difficult time deciding if it would end as a free or slave state. These acts sparked the inception of Bleeding Kansas. The North reacted immediately to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The New England Emigrant Aid sent settlers to Kansas to secure the territory as a free state. Nearly 1,200 Northerners made the trip to Kansas Territory. They were armed with Sharp's rifles, which came to be known as Beecher's Bibles because the rifles were furnished by abolitionist minister Henry Ward Beecher. Stories spread through the South that 20,000 Northerners were coming to Kansas. In response to these rumors, thousands of armed Southerners crossed the Kansas-Missouri border to vote for a pro-slavery congressional delegate. Only half the ballots cast were by registered voters. The pro-slavery forces won the election. An additional election was held to decide members of the territorial legislature. The Missourians crossed the border in masses once again. This time, their numbers grew from 3,000 registered voters to 6,000 actual ballots cast. Only 791 voted against slavery. The new legislature, which was called the Bogus Laws by Northerners, incorporated the Missouri Slave Code. The Bogus Laws included severe penalties against anyone who spoke or wrote against slaveholding. The Northerners were furious and created their own free state legislature in Topeka. Kansas now had two established governments. Each government outlawed the other. Violence continued to spread throughout Kansas. The future of Kansas was not going to be determined by the violent behavior being spread throughout the state. Instead, for Kansas to abolish its slave laws and become a free state, the battle was going to have to happen between politicians in order to create a fair constitution that would be approved by the U.S. Congress. Between 1854 and 1861, Kansas had 4 different constitutional conventions. Kansas had 10 different governors, the capital moved to 5 different towns, and 2 separate legislatures existed at the same time. Fraudulent elections, threats of violence, and congressional disagreements all prolonged Bleeding Kansas. The conflict lasted such a long time because delegates could not write a constitution for the state of Kansas that satisfied both the people of the territory and the U.S. Congress. All 4 proposals had benefits and detriments, but in the end, one was successful. The Topeka Constitution was proposed in 1855. This constitution suggested a free Kansas and was the first constitution to fail. The separate government legislature set up by Northerners in Topeka was technically illegal. Congress would not accept the Topeka Constitution because the federal government did not recognize it. The Lecompton Constitution was proposed in 1857. This constitution declared Kansas a pro-slavery state. There were 3 different votes on this document because control of the legislature shifted between free state and pro-slavery. Like Kansas, the U.S. Congress was also divided on the issue of slavery. Congress's members were unsure the Constitution represented the will of the people. Thus, it was never ratified. Although this Constitution was not ratified, it was part of the political conversations across the nation. President Buchanan, who was a supporter of slaveholder rights, endorsed the Lecompton Constitution before Congress. Considerable evidence exists, though, that Buchanan's efforts to bulldoze the Lecompton Constitution through Congress involved several forms of bribery. The Lecompton Constitution was also a central part of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were a series of debates between Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, and the incumbent Stephen Douglas, a Democrat. They were running for an Illinois Senate seat. In Lincoln's House divided speech, Lincoln said, "At length, a squabble springs up between the President and the author of the Nebraska Bill. On the mere question of fact, whether the Lecompton Constitution was or was not, in any just sense, made by the people of Kansas. In that quarrel, the latter declares that all he wants is a fair vote for the people, and that he cares not whether slavery be voted down or voted up." The third attempt for a ratified constitution for Kansas was in 1858 with the Leavenworth Constitution, which proposed Kansas a free state. It failed because Free Staters were in control of the legislature and passed a radical anti-slavery constitution granting voting rights to African Americans. The Constitution was ratified by Kansas voters but not approved by the U.S. Congress. Pro-slavery leaders controlled the Congress, where they ensured its failure at a national level. The Wyandotte Constitution was the last constitution. Written in 1859, this constitution succeeded because it was less radical than the Leavenworth. It provided voting rights for white males only, not blacks or Indians. Although Kansas voters easily approved it, the Constitution didn't gain congressional approval until Southern states began seceding from the Union. The balance of power in the U.S. Senate then shifted to free states, and Kansas entered the Union on January 19, 1861, the 34th star.